let's think about what the Trump administration is trying to do and why they're trying to do it. And so it was very much not necessarily like advocacy. It was sort of like, okay, these are the problems that the Trump administration sees. This is what they're likely to do. Here's why they would do these things. And here's what the likely effects of those things would be. Yeah, so I think the basic premise is that you really have to understand how the international monetary system works to understand what the problem is. And so
Dr. Joshua R. Hendrickson is a leading expert in monetary economics, specializing in Bitcoin and the political economy of money.
An associate professor at the University of Mississippi and a senior fellow at multiple institutes. His research shapes the future of finance in top economic journals.
a lot of people, when they talk about trade, they're sort of implicitly making these arguments based on a world where like trade imbalances correct themselves. Yeah, those arguments work in the textbook and they work under certain circumstances, but in the current circumstances, neither one of those mechanisms is operable. And so the issue is that, yeah, like these imbalances are kind of unique to the fiat system, but the reason we have the system in place in the first place is because governments want things out of the monetary system that aren't always possible. If you do that, like if you're worried about the dollar's status or if you want people to diversify towards neutral assets, then the argument that you should really be making is you should be pushing people to hold more gold and hold more Bitcoin, right?
Hey guys, welcome back to Less Noise, More Signal. Today, another great guest that I'm able to interview. It's Josh Hendrickson, economist, also quite familiar with Bitcoin and just sort of how the fiat system and everything works. Really glad to have you on the show, Josh.
Happy to be here.
Cool. Well, I mean, before we start, I quickly wanted to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. I mean, sort of, at least for me, you burst on the scene with a few other shows that you did and just sort of interesting takes that you had also with the, I think, Bitcoin Policy Institute that you were associated with. So it would be great to sort of know you, what you're doing and how you're sort of linked to this space as well.
Yeah, so I am an economics professor at the University of Mississippi. I'm also chair of the economics department here. And I'm a senior fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. So my specialty, I guess, as an economist is as a monetary economist. And so that sort of naturally segues into thinking about Bitcoin.
Yes, exactly. It does. Yeah. That's exactly how I discovered Bitcoin as well. Just before, it's usually the other way around, you know, like a lot of people are sort of into Bitcoin and then they get to study monetary economics and Austrian economics as well. And for me, it was sort of the other way around. I originally was studying Austrian economics, monetary history and everything. And that sort of led me to Bitcoin. So certainly a tight connection there. Well, I mean, for today's discussion, you know, obviously we had, we're recording this at the time where the US just sort of announced through this executive order a strategic Bitcoin reserve, you know, and thereby sort of declaring Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset, which I think is huge, you know, and is sort of underappreciated also by the market, or at least that's what the price is telling me. But I want to talk about this, you know, maybe from a sort of different angle, because a lot of people like Matthew Pines and others, they have done a great job of sort of explaining why Bitcoin is potentially a strategic asset. And now obviously it is if the US government is sort of labeling it like this. But I would like to take this slightly more a high level perspective. And to do this, I want to discuss this recent paper by a guy called Stephen Miron. I think he's another economist out of the US, and he had this really great paper, A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. And there he does a great job of carving out today's monetary and geoeconomic challenges that the world is facing as such. And I would encourage everyone to read that rather heavy paper. But I think you've read it as well. And I think we can also sort of tie this back to Bitcoin, maybe also sort of elaborate where the actual problems lie, how they are connected to the fiat system, how that might even be the root or at least like a major contributing factor. So, I just want to give it to you. And maybe first, if you sort of can comment on that paper, why you thought it's so intriguing, interesting, and what you take from it, so to say.
Yeah, I guess what interested me about the paper is that when Moran got nominated to be the head of the CEA in the Trump administration, I knew who he was. I was familiar with some things that he had written, but I didn't know him very well. So I kind of just started digging around to see, like what he had written and what, he was thinking. And I knew people who knew him. And so, and they were telling me, hey, he's really good. He's thought about a lot of this stuff. And so what ended up happening is I found this paper. So it was written for clients of the hedge fund he's working for. And it was essentially just like, the structure of the argument was like, let's think about what the Trump administration is trying to do and why they're trying to do it. And so it was very much not necessarily like advocacy. It was sort of like, okay, these are the problems that the Trump administration sees. This is what they're likely to do. Here's why they would do these things. And here's what the likely effects of those things would be. And the fact that he wrote that before he was nominated and then was subsequently nominated suggests that, he does understand what they're trying to do and that the administration appreciates his insights on these things. And so when you dig into it, there's a lot there. It was touching on a lot of topics that I think about also. And it also touches on things that I think are often neglected in conversations about the status quo of the world that we live in right now. And so, but most importantly, I guess what it did is that Trump is extremely divisive. And so because he's divisive, a lot of the criticism is sort of like, oh, he's an idiot, or like, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, or things like that. And the issue is like, whatever you think of him, he has a particular team of advisors, and those advisors are making these arguments. And many of these advisors, at least this time around, many of these advisors who are making these arguments, like they didn't start making them because they started working for Donald Trump. Like they're working for Donald Trump because they were already making these arguments. And so he has people who are kind of aligned with the things that he wants to do. And so my perspective is that, if we want to understand what the administration is trying to do, whether you support the policy or oppose the policy, you should at least try to understand what the logic behind the policy is. Because if you don't understand the logic behind the policy, then you're not going to be able to assess whether it's going to achieve its goals, right? You need to understand what their objectives are and how they're going to try to achieve those objectives before you can say it's going to work or it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well said. Exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm hearing as well from a lot of people. Like Trump, he's just sort of shooting from the hip, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But as he said, like this time around, I mean, it feels like Trump has a really eloquent and also informed team, and that sort of have thought about these sort of things in depth, and that's what's so fascinating, and that's why it makes a lot of sense to sort of listen to these people and also read what they sort of write about, So, but maybe just to start off then, I want to talk about what is sort of proposed as well in the paper. Maybe not that much about the tariffs and everything, but sort of maybe then when it comes to also the Bitcoin stuff, that I feel like it is related. But just to start off, maybe for folks who haven't read the paper, can we maybe start with the problem, the key problem that he's sort of also describing in the beginning of the paper, and that's really plaguing our monetary system?
Yeah, so I think the basic premise is that you really have to understand how the international monetary system works to understand what the problem is. And so the United States has the global reserve currency. And so what that means is that that's the currency that is being used in trade. And so most of international trade is being conducted in dollars. At the same time, the U.S. also issues the global reserve asset. So the U.S. Treasury security is the main reserve asset of the world, right? This is what foreign central banks are holding and things like that. When they're not really holding dollars, they're holding treasuries. And so the issue there is that system provides a lot of benefits to the United States. And one of the reasons it provides a lot of benefits is that the United States doesn't have to worry about the balance of payments. The United States really doesn't have to worry about its debt because there's a lot of passive buyers for the debt. And also the United States is able to use the dollar's role to avoid military conflict and instead impose economic costs on other countries when there's conflict. So instead of having direct military conflict, maybe they just levy economic sanctions and try to cut people off from the dollar-based system. And so those are the benefits of the system. What Moran's paper is really about is, okay, what are the costs? Because clearly the United States likes those benefits, but what are the costs? And the costs are that the only way that the rest of the world can acquire the dollars that they need for international trade is through trade surpluses. They have to run trade surpluses with the United States in order to bring in dollars that they can then use to trade with the rest of the world. So what that means is that the United States has to run persistent trade deficits where, we're buying goods and then we're sending these dollars abroad. And no doubt this generates benefits for the United States because, what this allows us to do is it basically allows us to export dollars and import goods. But there's a cost there, and the cost is that if you're not running large enough trade deficits, or if the dollar is just sufficiently scarce on global markets, then the dollar is overvalued. And if the dollar is overvalued, this is a really good deal for U.S. consumers because it means all these foreign goods are effectively cheaper, and so consumers are able to consume things that maybe they wouldn't be able to otherwise. But at the same time, that also means that labor costs elsewhere are cheaper and other input costs are cheaper elsewhere because of the strength of the dollar, which encourages U.S. companies to relocate their production processes overseas where things are cheaper, where the dollar goes farther. And then, and so what that tends to do is then that tends to hollow out the sort of manufacturing base of the United States. So that's one of the costs. The other cost is that because you have foreign central banks holding U.S. Treasury securities, they're passive buyers. They're not price sensitive, right? They're just buying these securities because they need to hold dollars over time. They don't want to hold literal dollars because physical dollars pay no interest. So they take those dollars, they buy treasuries, and then those treasuries allow them to earn some interest on those dollar balances. But the thing is like they're not concerned with the price of treasuries. They just need to hold these things. This is the reserve asset. So they're price insensitive. And what that means is that when the United States runs up large budget deficits and they're issuing a bunch more debt, the prices of these bonds don't necessarily change because you have all of these passive buyers out in the market. And so the issue then becomes thinking about a world where economies around the world are growing, right? So if the United States is growing at like 2.5–3% a year, and the rest of the world is growing at say 4 or 5% a year, well, then what that means is that the demand for reserves is sort of like unit elastic, right? You tend to increase your reserves. Every 1% increase in your output leads to a 1% increase in your demand for reserves. So what tends to happen is that the demand for these U.S. treasuries is growing at the rate of growth of the rest of the world. And so if the United States is not producing that level of debt for the rest of the world, then what happens is that the price of those bonds goes up, the yields go down. But this encourages then our politicians in the United States to say, look how cheap we can borrow. Like we should be doing lots more things. We should be building all of these things that we want to build. And we should be doing all of these different pet projects and even projects that don't necessarily make a lot of sense from investment purposes. Well, I mean, we don't really pay interest on it. So our interest rates are so low. So who really cares, right? Like it's not that costly. And so, so in other words, what tends to happen is that these politicians tend to meet that growing demand for debt by increasing the supply of debt. And so Moran's point is that if you look at the data over the longer term, what you find is like that the United States doesn't seem to be able to borrow more cheaply than everybody else, even though they have this privilege. But that's because they're just growing the debt alongside the demand, right? So they're responding to that demand for more U.S. government debt by supplying more U.S. government debt. And his point is that if the United States was growing faster than the rest of the world, that's not really an issue. But if the rest of the world is growing faster than the United States, then what happens is that you get this growing debt to GDP ratio. And the issue is that if you read the literature on like how this international monetary system works, with the dollar sort of being in the center and this debt instrument being the global reserve asset, the issue is that when debt gets to a sufficiently large level, people start to get concerned that you're not actually going to pay it back, or that you're going to inflate away the value of that debt. And so when that happens, because it's a fiat system, like that can actually just be self-fulfilling. So you can get to a certain point where people just say like, oh, we're afraid you're not going to pay back the debt. So they start selling the bonds. And that frantic selling of the bonds leads to chaos in the treasury market. And then, the Federal Reserve steps in and goes, oh, well, we got to stabilize the treasury market. And they do that by buying the treasuries that people are selling. And, the end result of that is that you just end up sort of monetizing some of the debt. And so it just becomes self-fulfilling, right? People expect it to happen, and then their actions actually force it to happen. And so this is a problem. You don't want to find yourself in that scenario. And this is kind of Moran's main point, is that this system, yes, provides the U.S. some benefits, and the U.S. really wants to keep the system, but what the Trump administration really wants is to keep the system and minimize some of these costs, right? So the hollowing out of the industrial base, the ever-growing government debt, these are the things that the administration is worried about, and that those are characteristics of the system. And so there has to be some kind of reform to the system to stop or to minimize those costs.
This show is brought to you by NewHedge. In a market driven by complexity, insight is everything. NewHedge is a dedicated Bitcoin analytics and intelligence platform delivering cutting-edge analysis, on-chain metrics, and real-time market data. With 200 plus proprietary indicators, live derivatives data, and adoption metrics, NewHedge provides the depth and precision that serious market participants demand. Backed by some of Bitcoin's most prolific investors, NewHedge connects traditional finance with Bitcoin's evolving landscape. Gain your data edge today. Sign up for free now at newhedge.io and get 50% off your advanced subscription with the code SIGNAL. Yeah, exactly. Well explained. Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly the thing, which makes it so special, or sort of that the Trump administration is actually talking about these things, because like what you described and what Moran is describing in the paper, it's really summed up with this word exorbitant privilege, that was back in the day, with this French sort of government official who wanted to get the gold back, and he was like, okay, you the US, you have the exorbitant privilege. And sort of this was always said in a sense of like the US is only profiting from this, and probably net profiting from this. And I would be interested to hearing your analysis or sort of take, is it net profiting the US or is it not? But the thing is, what I find interesting is that sort of these people, Besant, Trump, all the people, they are now actually pointing their finger to this fact that there are these socioeconomic problems, and then also that probably we have to do something about this, because there are these costs, because it felt like the previous administrations in the US, they never really even addressed these points, and that's what I find so fascinating. But would you say, in terms of when it comes to the US, is it net positive still to have sort of the reserve currency to issue, or is this exactly what Trump and now Moran and all these people point to? No, maybe not. Maybe it's not net positive, and we're actually losing out here in the long term, so to say.
Well, I think the issue is that if you kind of look at the literature on how this system works, there's sort of you can think of there just being different states of the world, right? Like, and the issue is that those states of the world are entirely dependent upon like how much debt is out there, right? So for low enough levels of debt, yes, this is a net positive to like the US. But at a sufficiently high level of debt, this is a net negative. But then there's this intermediate range where it's not clear whether it's actually a net positive or net negative. But then the other thing that we have to think about too is who is it net positive for and who is it net negative for, right? So when we're talking about net positive and net negative, we're generally thinking about this from the perspective of the government. And so from the perspective of the American people, it kind of depends on who you are, right? And what you do for a living and those kinds of things, right? Like if you are fortunate enough to work in, a white collar job, then this system's really good for you because it makes everything cheaper. It doesn't really threaten your employment, right? Like that's not really an issue to you. If you work a more blue collar job, especially in things like manufacturing, like this kind of system, can incentivize people to move production overseas for reasons that aren't necessarily related to comparative advantage. They're related to, the value of the dollar and this premium that's on the dollar because the dollar is the global reserve currency. And so if you're those types of people, it's not actually clear because, there are lots of things, like you can go to Walmart and you can buy things that are a lot cheaper than they would be, otherwise. But you don't have the same level of job security that you had before. And if you lose your job, like the opportunities to just seamlessly move into a new job aren't necessarily available.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's well summarized by these graphs, that people have been sharing around for quite some time, where you sort of see that, especially in the US, like the equity markets and just financialization in general, it has just grown. You're really at the cost of the real economy, when you look back at maybe 1970 or even earlier, you really feel like the real economy has had a much bigger grip, so to say, on it all, and now it's the financialization which is taking over. And then obviously, as you said, it's all these people working in the financial sector that are handsomely profiting from this, but the ones who maybe are not exposed to this system, they're increasingly being left behind. And I feel a lot of people are feeling this and and that's exactly what you're now pinpointing to, and saying this is the problem, so to say, right?
Yeah, and I think, Moran mentions this in the paper. He talks about like socioeconomic problems. This is what he's really talking about is if you look at like, there are a couple of things that we can point to, right? Like there's this entire economic literature on sort of like deaths of despair, right? And it's just sort of like there are certain communities in the United States where you just have people dying like far too young. And like what these economists are fundamentally blaming that on is like the lack of opportunity for people, right? And so they don't have the same opportunities that maybe a previous generation in that same area had or something like that. And so, they're just living much, much shorter lives. I think the other thing is that, there's a lot of talk in the US and in Europe about like declining fertility rates. There's also like a lot of talk about declining like marriage rates and things like that. And I think that a lot of like popular criticisms of this actually miss the mark, right? So I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, the reason that, fewer people are getting married and fewer people are having children is like, it's just, it's some combination of like feminism and like more women entering the workforce and things like that. But if you look at the data, women who go to college are much more likely to be married and have children than women who don't. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be the right explanation. And actually what you see happening is that the market that's being affected the most is essentially among like men who have a high school degree or less. They tend they're much less likely to get married. They're much less likely to have children. If they do have children, they're generally not having children with a spouse, right? And so you end up with a lot of single parent households and things like that. And there's been research on this that suggests that what's going on here is that the good job prospects for men who only have a high school degree or maybe even less that used to exist in a previous generation, like they don't exist now. And that is destroying the marriage market because women look at those men and they think, well, they can't provide for me. They can't provide, they can't support a child. And that doesn't mean they won't have a relationship and date those men. It doesn't mean that they might, it doesn't mean that they won't still have children with those men, whether intended or otherwise. But the issue is like they don't end up, um, they're less likely to end up married, and they're less likely to co-parent the children. And so that's not just a problem for these men and women who can't, um, you know, uh, who aren't getting married or who aren't having kids or things like that. It's also a problem for these kids because, this sounds obvious, but if you have, two parents, that's a huge advantage over somebody who has one parent. And that's not to denigrate like single parenthood. That's just an obvious statement that like, if you have two parents, first of all, you have twice as much time available with your parents because there's two of them. And then the other thing is that you potentially have a second source of income for the household. And so, you combine that time and that income, that's going to create a lot of opportunities for children. And so if you're having a lot more, single parent households, and this being driven by, like the destruction of this marriage market, then that's putting those children at a disadvantage. That doesn't mean that an individual child might not, still do well, or that there aren't like amazing single mothers out there. It's just that on average, those children are going to do worse.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's just this general sort of, reality that we have today, that because of this systemic problem, so to say, that stem from a system that is sort of described now in the Moran paper, that this is a really strong current and tide that you're swimming against up, or you're swinging against, and sort of a lot of people obviously don't know this. And then also if you point to these sort of systematic problems, and a lot of people are like, well, this is sort of conspiracy theorist ideas, but in the end, it's not, because it's all shaped by these incentives and by a system. It's obviously probably not monocausal, that it's just one cause that's, or it's the only like contributing factor, but I guess it's, there are these systemic sort of factors that are driving this, and so it's really important, I guess, because now the Trump administration and these people are actually talking about this, out in the open, in the media, that maybe more people are sort of are being made aware of these sort of problems, But maybe coming back to this net negative, net positive, in terms of the U.S. versus the rest of the world. I think one takeaway or major takeaway that I also had when I read the paper is that sort of, well, it might be net positive for the US, to have that. But in the end, if we keep on going like this, because like we are accumulating ever more debt, there might be a sort of a tipping point that might be reached at some point where these deficits just grow large enough, to induce like real systemic risk in terms of like credit risk, in this reserve asset. And if then the US were to fail, I mean, then the rest of the world will also be really bad off, because like it's exactly the reserve asset and the US hegemon and everything that has the system kept going for so long. And so it's sort of, we're all in the same boat. We're all hanging in there together. And if it's going to fail because the US just builds up too much debt because it has to provide that debt, then we're all going to be screwed. Is that sort of a fair assumption and takeaway as well?
I think the general stance in the administration is that the system is unsustainable, that if we continue on this current path, that there's going to be sufficient costs for the United States. So either that's going to lead to like, debt that we just can't possibly pay back and we have to resort to, inflating it away, or whether this is, the idea that, we end up at war and we lack the manufacturing capacity to really, to build the things that you need to go to war. And I think that these are some of their main concerns, is they think that they're looking at the system and they don't want to give it up. And the reason that they don't want to give it up is it potentially provides a lot of benefits for them, right? But also they don't want to give it up because I think for a lot of policymakers, what they see is that if they were to give up this role of the dollar, that there would just be some other currency that would take that role, and that would just transfer this power or this potential power to someone else. And so the attitude is, if somebody's going to have the power, it should be us. And so what we need to do is we need to like reform the system to limit the things that are creating unsustainable trajectories, but try to maintain, the system while we do that. So we, kind of keep the good things, get rid of the bad things, which is obviously easier said than done, but they're being explicit about like, this is what they really think and this is what they're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to talk about potential solutions and stuff that he's also addressing, in the paper, Miran himself. But I want to have one more question, and that sort of revolves around the problem, and I want to put on my Bitcoiner hat here for a minute, because like Bitcoiners, obviously, they're pointing to a lot of these problems, sort of a lot of the things that we described, the thing also with the socioeconomic problems that you described, they all sort of have an answer, and they pin it on the fiat system, so to say. And I mean, if I read the Moran paper, that the problems are also sort of described, but sort of not mentioning the fiat system, so to say, outright, And now my question sort of is, do you see a connection there, or are Bitcoiners just sort of jumping the gun when they pointed all to the fiat system? Sort of also, I mean, it's obviously a fact of a fiat system that we will have we'll need a reserve currency, and that's going to be fiat. But we might just as well, we could have a reserve currency which is back to Bitcoin, and then issued by the US, it would still be a reserve currency. We might have the same problem still. So, sort of, what is your analysis there?
Well, I think the problems that they describe are part of like a very, very long process that has been going on essentially since the end of World War I. Okay. And I think that what happened is that during World War I, the United States delayed its involvement for so long, but was selling a lot of goods to the rest of the world. Those countries, had suspended the gold standard. And so the United States wasn't taking, pounds and francs and marks from people when they wanted to buy things from the United States. They were making them send gold. And so the United States had accumulated like a substantial fraction of the monetary gold in the world by the end of World War I. And the issue is that in World War I, it was sort of like the first kind of global conflict where you had countries do this, but they did something that the Bank of England kind of introduced to the world, which was you go to war, you suspend the convertibility of your currency into gold, but then you promise that at the end of the war, you're going to go back at the previous parity to gold. And the reason that you do that is that's what allows you to finance the war. You can now use your central bank as a source of either paying for stuff with money creation or just as a source of credit. And so the thing is, though, is for that system to work, you have to have that credible commitment to return to the gold standard at the previous parity to your currency. And so England had used this, multiple times, going back to like the Napoleonic Wars. They had used this strategy successfully, and other people clearly learned from this, such that in World War I, this was kind of the general plan for all of the countries involved. Is, we'll go off the gold standard during the war. At the end, we'll go back on at the previous parity. The issue is that what that does is that tends to lead to high rates of inflation during the war. But then like a very severe deflation after the war as you try to pull all of that money and liquidity out of the system to restore the gold standard. And that, and both of those things are costly, right? And so what a lot of countries were trying to figure out how to do after World War I was just like avoid that costly deflation that would come next. The issue is that, so some of them did this by basically just reneging on their commitment. They returned to the gold standard, but they returned to it, at a devalued currency, right? And so they gave up on their commitment, but, the US and the UK wouldn't do that. And so it was recognized ahead of time that if the US and the UK were going to actually follow through with this, all of these other countries that were going back on the gold standard, they were going to have to accumulate gold reserves. But an increase in the demand for gold, like if you're on the gold standard, like everybody's currency is defined as a particular quantity of gold. So if the demand for gold goes up, the nominal price can't go up like it should. So what has to happen is all other prices have to fall to clear the gold market. And so what ends up happening here is that for, a lot of the 1920s, what was going on is that the US and the UK were taking turns allowing gold to flow out to these other countries, essentially offsetting the increase in demand for gold with a reduction in demand for gold on their end. And that reallocation was a form of cooperation. And a number of economists kind of had suggested that this was what was going to have to happen if they were going to avoid a severe deflation. The issue is that both France and the United States eventually prioritized their own domestic concerns over the international gold standard, such that by the end of the 1920s, the United States wasn't allowing this gold to flow out, and France was trying to accumulate a lot of gold reserves. And so what that did is it created this huge demand for monetary gold. That huge demand for monetary gold led to deflation. And so because of that, we ended up having the Great Depression. The lesson that policymakers learned from this is that, this scramble for gold was bad and we need to come up with a new system. So like the Bretton Woods system was basically designed to fix this flaw in the international gold standard. And that was to basically make the dollar equivalent to gold. And so the dollar will be equivalent to gold. And so we never have to worry about there being an excess demand for gold, because if people can't get the gold, they can just get dollars. And the reason that will be useful is that the dollar supply can be an elastic supply, whereas, gold is kind of determined by the gold market. And so the idea is that, we'll just have that system instead. But the reason that we're in the current system is that people realize that you can design a system where you say that the dollar and gold are perfect substitutes. But whether something is actually a perfect substitute really depends on the market. Like the market determines whether it's a perfect substitute, not the law. And so what tended to happen is the United States, because of its involvement around the world, because of it operating as sort of like a worldwide policeman and providing a defense umbrella for its allies around the world, they were spending lots of money and lots of dollars were flowing abroad. And there were many countries who wanted to redeem those dollars for gold because they were afraid that the United States was issuing too many dollars. And what happened is that the United States started going to these other countries and saying, look, we're doing all of these things for you. We provide you with a defense umbrella. We're spending more than we would spend otherwise. We're sending all of this money abroad, but we're doing this to help Europe and our other allies. And so, you guys can't have the gold. Like, well, just buy treasury bonds. Don't, you don't need to buy the gold. And that worked for a little while. But, but over time, there's still more dollars flowing abroad. The United States is still running persistent budget deficits and issuing more debt. People are getting concerned about this. And so, Europeans wanted their gold back. And eventually Nixon closes the gold window. And, Nixon gets a lot of the blame for this. But frankly, he really had no choice here. Like what he could have done is he could have either devalued the dollar or he could just close the gold window and try to maintain the current system. So I don't think any other president would have done things differently. But that left us in this current system. And so the issue is that, these imbalances are kind of unique to the fiat system. But the reason we have the system in place in the first place is because governments want things out of the monetary system that aren't always possible. And so you cannot, you're not going to be able to design an international monetary system that solves every problem, right? Like there's a famous Thomas Sowell line where he says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And this is a thing that international monetary economists and wrestle with. And this is something that politicians engaged in the international monetary system need to recognize, is that there's always these trade-offs. And what they seem to be doing is we seem to be on this path where we're constantly trying to reform the system to do the things that we want it to do, that it's not doing under the existing arrangements. And so to me, I see what the Trump administration is doing as just a continuation of this pattern. Like we've gotten to the point where now they're looking at this system in the same way that sort of the Nixon administration was looking at this system in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where they're saying, I don't know that this is sustainable, but we need to get these other countries to adjust their behavior because at least some of this is driven by their decisions and also driven by the things that we provide for them, like this U.S. defense umbrella.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's a lot to take in here, but I think that's very well explained. I mean, yeah, as far as I understand you, then, I mean, just to summarize this, maybe it's sort of you're telling me that, yeah, it's actually true that in a system maybe where we still had sort of government issued currencies, but they were sort of backed to gold or to potentially something else, another hard asset, we might not have the same problem, in the sense of like, obviously, the gold standard, it had its own problems. It failed for some reasons, I wouldn't be like so like how would I say, so blunt to say, okay, it's all just because the government wanted it to fail. There were actually some real constraints, as you say, trade-offs, but if we just look at it from an isolated perspective, sort of, it is sort of true because we are not tied. Our currencies today are not tied to some real value anymore, like a neutral reserve asset. Then the thing is, these trade imbalances can lead to other countries sort of accumulating these other sort of fiat currencies, and then they're also sort of incentivized to go initiate this beggar thy neighbor policy, where they constantly devalue their currency. And that also has then exchange rate consequences in terms of like, okay, one currency is just constantly devalued, and then obviously the economy adapts to this, and then because labor is really cheap in these countries where this constant devaluation is happening faster and stronger, all the labor components are moving to that country, and then you have sort of this in a globalized world as we have today as well. Sweatshops end up in these countries, because that's something I was usually, again, way back in time, arguing with some people about, are sweatshops good or not? And then sort of, if you have like a libertarian stance, you're sort of, it's not that bad, because these people are being employed and get some work, and that these arguments are all fine. But then at the same time, it only just recently dawned on me, because we have such a system, this monetary system with fiat and the dollar being the reserve asset, where all these distortions actually exist. It's artificially, so to say, enhanced as well. Maybe in a world where this would not be the case, maybe there weren't that many sweatshops in these low labor or low wage labor countries. So, I mean, it's actually true, right? That just looking at it from an isolated perspective, we can argue, it is somewhat connected to the fiat system as such, right?
Yeah, so I think like these, the thing that we kind of have to keep in mind here, right, is that when we make like when we make arguments, our arguments are always institution dependent, right? And so the rules of the game matter. And so when we're thinking about particular issues, we really have to understand what the rules of the game are in that particular circumstance, right? So, I mean, like students get this immediately when you talk about like certain things and you use like a really simple model or something in class, right? Students will say like, oh, well, we made this assumption. Does that assumption matter? Because if it matters, like then maybe we would get like a different result. But the thing is like, we have to think about that when we're thinking about these big picture issues as well, because sometimes when we're talking about things like trade, we have this model in our head that's actually based more on like the gold standard world than than it is on the world that we live in now. I mean, Moran points this out, right? That like a lot of people, when they talk about trade, they're sort of implicitly making these arguments based on a world where like trade imbalances correct themselves. And so the point there is that, we have models of fixed exchange rates. We have models of flexible exchange rates where these things correct themselves. But in the US case, there's no market correction here because the United States is sending these dollars overseas. And that's that's essentially an export of the US. And so then you have to sort of trace out, okay, what are the consequences of being an exporter of dollars, right? Because a lot of our trade arguments are based on the fact that, well, there's a market correcting mechanism here, right? If you're running up trade deficits, under the gold standard, eventually this is going to require you to ship gold, overseas, and then that's going to force you to adjust your behavior at home, or there are, even under flexible exchange rates, if you're shipping too much of your currency abroad, that's going to tend to devalue your currency, right, on the market, and then you're not going to be able to run those trade deficits anymore because these goods that you're buying from abroad suddenly become a lot more expensive. And what he's pointing out is that those arguments work in the textbook and they work under certain circumstances, but in the current circumstances, neither one of those mechanisms is operable. And so we have to trace out the consequences of the system that we have and not rely on these sort of off-the-shelf models, because they're sort of, our conclusions are institution dependent. They depend on what kind of system we have in place at the time.
Mm. Yeah, that's well said. Obviously, the system that we actually are with is quite complex, and it's always more Byzantine than you probably think in theory that it is. But then what is the solution then? Like Miran, what is he now pointing to, and where do we need to make changes to sort of better things?
Well, I think that Moran's argument, I think, is actually kind of an optimistic argument. I mean, I think his argument is that in the short run, you can impose, tariffs on your trading partners, and that this is actually going to impose more costs on our trading partners than it will impose on the United States. And because of that, that's what will bring them to the negotiating table. I mean, you mentioned the famous French argument about exorbitant privilege. When the United States complains about the costs of the current system, nobody else cares about those complaints, right? Like the rest of the world looks at the US and says, you're getting all of these benefits from the system. So yeah, you're talking about these costs. So what? You get all these benefits. We don't get those benefits. Why should we care that those benefits come with costs? That's your problem. That's not our problem. And I think that what Moran is essentially arguing is that the tariffs are being used as a tool to force these people to the negotiation table. So you impose a cost on them, and then you kind of say, okay, look, you want to get rid of these costs, come to the table and let's see what we can do to resolve this. And I think that his reading is optimistic. He believes, he at least thinks that there's a reasonable possibility that you impose these tariffs, people come to the table, and then ultimately what the United States is going to want is it's going to want other countries to sort of devalue or to revalue their currencies, so that their currencies are stronger on global markets, to offset this premium that exists on the dollar, and that will eliminate some of these some of these imbalances.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. I mean, what is your take on how successful he's going to be with these things? Obviously, you've talked about the tariffs, the strategy that he has there to bring people to the negotiation table. But then within the paper, there's also stuff discussed these non-marketable debt instruments, like these 100-year debt instruments, or almost like consoles, or I think it was called back in the day, where it's sort of, just debt that constantly gets rolled over or never really comes due. And so, maybe you can sort of quickly explain this mechanism, and then also, what do you think? Is this going to be realistic, sort of, to pull off?
Yeah. So part of what they want to do, and Besant has actually talked about this a lot, is lengthening the maturity structure of the U.S. government debt. And there's obvious reasons for this. So first of all, when interest rates are low, conceivably, the United States should be locking in those rates over long periods of time, right? When interest rates are low, you should be issuing 30-year bonds, not 90-day bonds or 90-day bills, right? That's one of the points that he's making. But the other reason is the geopolitical reason is, if you start issuing these longer term bonds, what you're doing is then you're forcing the people who are holding those bonds, like there's a term premium on those bonds, there's a risk premium on those bonds because they're very, very long. So a lot can happen in 30 years, a lot can happen in 100 years, right? But the thing is that if you have this term premium and you have this risk premium, that aligns your incentives with the United States in a way that just owning, 90-day T-bills does not. I mean, in fact, this is something that goes all the way back to the Bank of England. So a lot of the the Bank of England was sort of the construction. It was political, right? I mean, it was founded to provide funding to the king, and it was devised by his Whig supporters. And the thing is what those Whig supporters realized early on is that actually by owning a lot of government debt, the Bank of England was insulated from the threats to restore the previous monarchy and things like that. Because if you were to do that, you would destroy the monetary system. Because what's the first thing that a king does when he comes and seizes power from the previous king? Is he repudiates all of the old king's debt, right? He says, well, I didn't issue that debt. I'm not going to pay that. I'm going to, but the thing is that if the king is, if the king is borrowing from the Bank of England, and so the Bank of England has all of this government debt, well, now the shareholders of the bank and everybody who participates in that banking system, they all now have a shared political interest in the continuation of the reign of the existing king. Well, Besant's argument is really no different than that. It's, look, we want you to hold 30-year bonds or 100-year bonds because we want you to have your interests align with us. If we are not successful, you're not going to get your money. And that is a risk that you're going to face. And so by lengthening out that maturity structure, you're potentially forcing these allies who are holding your debt to actually then have a vested interest in the long-term viability of not just the United States, but the system as a whole.
Yeah, I see. And what is your assessment? I mean, is it going to be successful after all? Like these types of strategies that are sort of sketched out in the paper?
I think it will depend. I mean, I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic than many of the people in my profession because, as Moran goes through the evidence from like the tariffs on China, a lot of the predictions that people were making about how costly these tariffs were going to be, like that actually just didn't play out. I mean, what he points out is like, yeah, there were distributional consequences. But in the aggregate, we really don't see any effects of these things in the aggregate data. But I think that's actually critical to whether this can be successful or not, because if that argument applies more broadly to these other tariffs where they're not showing up in aggregate data, yeah, there might be some distributional effects, but if they're not necessarily affecting things in the aggregate, then then they're likely to be much more successful because there's not going to be political backlash against what they're doing. On the other hand, if it starts to show up in the aggregate data if consumer prices are rising because of these tariffs and people are getting frustrated, or people expect these tariffs to be very short term, and then all of a sudden we're, a year and a half down the road and we still have these tariffs, there might be political backlash at that point. And then the question is, can you as a politician stay the course on that plan, given the backlash? Now, in theory, because Donald Trump can't run for president again, maybe he doesn't care about that. So maybe the political backlash just won't matter. But at the same time, I don't think that's a really good argument, because the issue is that for a lot of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do, for those things to be durable, he's going to need subsequent presidents to adopt the same sorts of strategies. And so he does, even though he can't run again, he does have kind of an interest in who wins the subsequent election. And so to the extent that he cares about that, then he might care a little bit about this political pressure. But I think ultimately it's going to matter, like, how much are Americans feeling the aggregate costs of these things, and then based on those costs, what is the political backlash that the administration faces for doing these things? If it's low, then I think, it's much more likely that it succeeds. But if the political backlash, happens quickly or it's pretty aggressive, then they might have to retreat on some of these things.
Mm. Yes, I see. Yeah, interesting. No, because when I was reading the paper, I also had this feeling of like, okay, this is sort of squaring the circle. He wants to have the cake and eat it too. The administration, because, like, you want to remain sort of have the US dollar remain and the reserve asset, of the world, but at the same time, try to ameliorate all these like costs that we now talked about. And so it felt like, well, that's quite as I said, you have to square the circle here, and that's maybe not possible in the end. And as you said, again, it's the same point that I'm thinking about now. It's just 4 years, or like potentially 2 and then 4 years, that he has, midterm another 2 years, but that might not be enough time to pull something like this off, which is of such big sort of significance, I would say. But maybe I wanna bring, to finish off here, I wanna bring back Bitcoin back, or potentially Bitcoin or something else, just like the idea of a neutral reserve asset, because I feel like the things that Miran describes, they're still sort of thinking inside the box type for me, like it's tariffs, and obviously, as you said, with these sort of non-marketable debt, which have a long maturity and stuff, it's all really radical thinking, and that's probably also why the paper still drew, a significant amount of attention, But the question is there also some type of out of the box thinking that we can apply here, alluding to, as I said, Bitcoin or other reserve assets that might be also able to help out here in this process? Is there any way we can think about that?
Yeah. So last April, I gave a speech at the Bitcoin Policy Institute's Bitcoin Policy Summit in DC. And the kind of subject of my speech was the same sort of issues that Moran is talking about. But what I kind of argued in that speech is that if the United States is really concerned about these things, one thing that it should do is it should be taking steps to make sure that if the dollar does lose its status, or if there's some modification to the system, that the way that this modification proceeds is by convincing people to move not to other sovereign currencies, but to move to neutral assets. And so my argument there was, it's that if you're looking at the system and you're saying, hey, this incentivizes us to run up too much debt, then the argument that you should really be making is you should be pushing people to hold more gold and hold more Bitcoin, right? Because you would want them to hold neutral assets rather than holding some other sovereign's asset. Because if they're switching to some other sovereign currency, you're just transferring all of the benefits that you have in this current system to this new place. And because the new place is not going to have the costs up front, right? So they're actually going to get a substantial benefit from this with very minimal costs, because they don't have the level of debt that the United States has and things like that. And so if you're concerned about the system, and if you're concerned that about the dollar status, or you're concerned that this system is unsustainable, or if you're concerned that some other sovereign currency is going to take the dollar's place, you should be trying to push these other countries into these neutral assets like gold and Bitcoin, because those aren't controlled by any sovereign. And so so when people switch from dollars to those assets, you're not transferring the benefits that you get from the dollar-based system to those to some other country.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see. And you think that the Trump administration is currently really sort of pushing the envelope here when it comes to Bitcoin? Is there any connection to this? That they're actually seeing this and just want to sort of, just put stuff in place for this eventuality, that you described. If shit really hit the fan, so to say, that there is a sort of a backdoor that they can take. Because I think, as far as I can recall, even Miran in his paper, right at the end somewhere, there was like this line saying, and in this type of environment, with all the things that we're thinking about here, Bitcoin and gold, or gold and Bitcoin, could potentially be doing well, or should be doing well, So I was just wondering, where's the connection here as well?
Well, I think I don't know. I don't know exactly what the administration is thinking on Bitcoin, because they don't. None of the advisors write as much about Bitcoin as they do all of these other issues. But you know, if we're just thinking about it and we're assuming that, I mean, lots of people just have cynical reasons for this. Like they say, oh, Trump just wants a Bitcoin reserve because, he went to the Bitcoin conference and they cheered him. And so he's sort of just like rewarding people for voting for him. And look, maybe maybe that is at least partially true. But I think the issue is that when you think about what's going on, like I prefer to think, okay, if I'm a policymaker, why would I want this kind of a thing? Why would I be trying to do this? And I think there's essentially a couple of reasons, right? So number one, if you're going to accumulate this reserve, maybe what it is you're just making a bet that Bitcoin is going to actually be a significant asset in global markets. And if that's the case, then Bitcoin is going to be worth a lot more dollars than it is right now. And so if you buy it now and you get into it now, like maybe there's a point in the future where the debt starts to become unsustainable. But in that world, you would expect the price of things like gold and Bitcoin to be rising, right? And rising pretty dramatically because people are trying to avoid what they see coming with the dollar. But in which case, if you own a lot of gold, if you own a lot of Bitcoin, then first of all, that might help you to avoid this situation completely, because people know that you could just sell the gold or sell the Bitcoin and you could pay down some of the debt, and that would relieve the pressure. So first of all, you'd have the option to do that, but also just the fact that you have that option might convince people that, hey, we don't need to run on this debt because they could always just sell that stuff and pay us back. I think if that's your strategy, there is a risk. If you buy too much Bitcoin, then it might scare people, right? So they might look at this and go, things must be way worse in the United States than we thought, right? Because if you're buying too much, that might look like that might look like you owe your bookie about like $250,000 and you have $250 to your name, and so you just go and you just put everything you own on like the Cleveland Browns to win the Super Bowl. I don't know if Europeans will get that joke, but you could do that and maybe that will pay off. But like if you're doing something like that, that might spook investors. It might spook financial markets. And so if you're doing it for that reason, you have to be careful how you're doing it. The other thing is it could just be like a sort of signaling thing, right? It could just be like, look, some of you might be interested in this. Some of you might be thinking about buying it yourselves. Like we, the United States government, are going to own it. And so if we own it, it's just sort of giving it like a stamp of approval, right? So that it creates a permission structure for others to do it. And so, if you do that, like if you're worried about the dollar's status, or if you want people to diversify towards neutral assets, then that's not necessarily a bad thing to signal to people, because that might convince them to not sell their treasuries and buy, some other sovereign debt instrument, but instead, sell it and buy Bitcoin, or sell it and buy gold, or something that's neutral, that's not going to transfer the benefits from the current system to those other people.
Yes, for sure. Well, I mean, as I can tell, things will surely remain interesting going forward. That's the least we can say for now. And Josh, thanks a lot for helping us understand sort of the monetary system a little better, and also this paper that I mentioned. I mean, to everyone who's not had the chance to read it, I would just recommend reading it. And even if we don't get everything, I mean, we now have sort of this episode that can help as a guideline. So thanks a lot for doing this. I think I have only one thing to ask you. Usually I have sort of this one question to every guest. Is there any other high signal person that we should bring on the show?
Oh, you should have given me a hint that I needed this before. I don't know if you've ever had him on, but like there's a sort of outside the box thinker that I like to listen to. I think like we agree on a lot of things. I don't know that we agree on everything, but I don't think that's true of anybody, I guess. Um but like if you haven't had like Luke Groman on your show, you should have him on the show. He thinks a lot about these issues, and he thinks very outside the box relative to a lot of other thinkers. Basically, he provides like institutional, or he provides research for institutional investors and things like that. But um, he's an interesting guy. He understands Bitcoin. He understands this like global system, and he's also probably like more pessimistic than I am about whether we can do anything about it. So maybe he can be like the counterbalance to me and my cautious optimism.
Nice. Well, yeah, exactly. Luke Roman, that's a great choice. I mean, he's obviously quite busy nowadays, but surely we'll probably use your word to maybe convince him once more, as a reason for him to come on the show. So, yeah, Josh, thanks a lot for doing all this great explaining. And yeah, just I think we learned a lot, and maybe in the future we can do it again. But for the time being, have a good one, and maybe just enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Enjoy the conversation.
Bye. Thank you.